Welcome to the first of this year's breakfast conversations with the Archbishop. And as we gather in this place, we acknowledge the original custodians of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and we honour their elders past and present. My name is Chris Lancaster. I'm the vicar of the parish of Altona and Laverton, and it's my honour to be the MC for this morning's conversation. And joining us this morning for a conversation with the Archbishop on the topic of economics for a sustainable future, how the choices we make today affect the generations still to come, are Kelly O'Dwyer and Adam Bandt. And let me give you a little bit more background about each of them. Kelly O'Dwyer was elected in 2009 as Liberal member for the federal seat of Higgins in southeastern Melbourne in a by-election following the retirement of former Treasurer Peter Costello. She served as chairman of the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Economics from 2013 and was a committee member from October 2010. And in December last year, Kelly was sworn in as the Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer. Before entering Parliament, she studied arts and law at Melbourne University. She practiced in the area of corporate law, was an economic policy advisor to the Federal Treasurer, and later worked as an executive at National Australia Bank. She's chairman of the Australia-United States Parliamentary Friendship Group and convener of the Australia-Americas Network. Kelly is the founder and chairman of the Parliamentary Friends of Women in Science, Maths and Engineering. In addition, Kelly serves as an ovarian cancer ambassador, patron of the Stonington City Brass and patron of the East Melbourne Junior Girls football team. So it's a broad portfolio. Adam Bandt is a Greens MP and the federal member for Melbourne. He was elected in 2010 when he became the first Greens MP elected to the House of Representatives at a general election and was subsequently re-elected in 2013. Adam was elected Deputy Leader in April 2012 and he's the federal Greens spokesperson on industrial relations, banking, science and industry. He was also a participant in the former government's multi-party committee on climate change, which put in place the Clean Energy Act. He studied arts and law at Murdoch University, where he won the Sir Ronald Wilson Prize for Academic Achievement, and he completed his PhD at Monash in 2008, researching the recent trend of governments to suspend basic human rights in areas such as migration, workplace relations and criminal law. And since being elected to Parliament, he's successfully moved motions on marriage equality and condemning the government's refugee deal with Malaysia. He's introduced legislation on protecting the Alpine National Park, banking reform, banning live animal exports, and parliamentary approval for sending troops overseas. And he was just a few moments ago telling me of an even greater claim to fame, perhaps, which was that in the 1930s, a distant relative of his invented the ute for Ford Australia. So would you please welcome Kelly O'Dwyer and Adam Bandt.
Thanks, and we need to congratulate Adam because it's his birthday today.
Yeah, happy birthday.
Well, actually, that introduction, Adam, is an interesting reminder, isn't it, of the kind of technological change we've been innovative in Australia about. I mean, I suppose a ute is not really world-defining, but, it's something that Australians have been innovative, and I guess at the time those changes were happening, people struggle to imagine a future, whereas we're in a process now. We've received the intergenerational report. We're trying to imagine a future from what we know now. Just perhaps for both of you, perhaps I'll start with Adam, just since I've mentioned that. How do you think our skills are at imagining futures? Because we place a lot of weight on extrapolations and other things, but just tell me your view of the reliability of what we seek to do.
I don't think we're very good at it, in a nutshell. I think that over the last probably 20 or 30 years, political imagination has diminished, and the capacity to have sensible discussions about what might happen in 10, 20, 30 years' time has shrunk. In some areas, we still can talk about it quite floridly, so we're able to talk about the national conversation at the moment is dominated by debt for future generations, but when it comes to, say, climate change, we find it a bit harder to talk about making the same kind of decisions now for given impacts that we're going to have in 20, 30, 40 years' time. So in short, it depends, but overall, I think we've kind of lost a lot of capacity to imagine the future.
And Kelly, you're clearly, I've heard you in Parliament speaking about the future and the forthcoming birth of your child, which will be very important, I think focuses the mind of all of us, especially mothers, on a future. How reliable do you think we are at being able to do this?
Well, look, I'm probably a little bit more optimistic than Adam in terms of, I do think that we can think about the future, perhaps not always coherently as we might like, but I think that Australians have got a very strong view that they want to leave a better future for their children and for their grandchildren. I think they believe that very strongly at the family level, and I think that that is writ large as well when we consider what governments ought to do in the national interest. I think you raised, Archbishop, the intergenerational report, and I think before you can realistically start a sensible conversation about the future, because we can imagine all sorts of things as we might like them to be, you need to have a base starting point as to where we currently are. And I think this is where someone like Peter Costello, who was my predecessor in the seat of Higgins, a former federal treasurer, I think the greatest treasurer we've had in this country, but I'm probably a little bit biased on that. He started, I think, a really terrific national conversation in 2002 when he brought down the very first intergenerational report. That was the first opportunity that we had as a nation to consider the path that we were currently on and the many choices that we have, the many future paths that we could be on, depending on the sort of country that we want our nation to be. And that conversation continues today, and Joe Hockey brought down the fourth and most recent intergenerational report only last week. And I think, and I'm sure we'll get into it, so I won't talk about all of the aspects now, but I think that is a really good starting point to have a conversation about the sort of nation that we want for our children, and whether we are going to be leaving them a better future than the one that we ourselves have had the benefit of enjoying.
Yeah, I had an opinion piece just a few weeks ago where I was arguing that we're in danger of, in a way, reconstructing our discourse, and I think we are having these national dialogues, but we're in danger of reconstructing it in terms of people selling something and citizens being consumers. And I think my argument was that instead of citizens being treated as moral subjects who had all of the opportunity to evaluate matters, consider real choices, make sacrifice if they needed to, because I think Australians are quite willing to make sacrifice if they feel there is a compelling argument. But it tends, for whatever reason, in my view, that the first question even put to citizens is what you're going to get out of it, and it's a very short-term thing. Now, you mightn't agree with that, but I'm interested just to reflect on that contrast, because a lot of the discourse, and even a lot of the discourse of politicians, is about they are either a manager or a salesman, which doesn't sound very high level if you look at governance, and it looks like we've descended a lot of things into what our immediate interest will be. So I'd be interested to hear both of your reactions to that.
I mean, I think you make an excellent point on that, and I think unfortunately this is where we have seen the ability to talk about our long-term future really inhibited or maybe hobbled, which is the point that you were talking about, Adam, before, because we see it in the construct of here and now rather than in broader terms, in a longer-term vision for the future of our country. And I think you're right to say that the media often, and we too, as parliamentarians, can be guilty of this, frame things as who is the winner and who is the loser. And it's always who is the visible winner and who is the visible loser. And we never ask ourselves the next question, what about the invisible loser out of the current system, or what about the invisible losers if we continue along this path And so I think we do lack that long-term perspective, and I think it's very important that we try and instill a longer-term perspective in our parliament, in the national discourse. I think having conversations like this are very useful because we actually get the opportunity to speak in more than just sound bites about critical issues.
And I think it's part of a broader trend. I'd say, looking back over, most acutely over the last 30 years, say in Australia, but probably even going back longer than that, it's not just about turning citizens into consumers, so all of a sudden you're not a passenger on a tram anymore, you're a customer. And whereas most people would actually just like their tram to arrive on time and be frequent and get them from A to B safely, now you're a customer and you're asked to maximise your experience on the tram. It's not just turning people into customers, it's also citizens into customers, it's turning citizens into competitors. And so we are being required more and more to compete with each other and to compete with ourselves even. And it infects the way governments talk as well. So we're having discussion about higher education at the moment, and the government's pushing reforms through on higher education. And the whole rhetoric is we want to free universities up to be able to compete with each other, so that money that could go on teaching is now spent on ridiculous advertisements. And all of a sudden you introduce the profit motive into something like into education. Meanwhile, Germany is saying, Germany just last year abolished tuition fees for universities and has said, they've sat back and said, look, we understand that in the future world we are not going to be able to compete with China or India on wages. Where are we going to go in the future? Our future as a country depends on being able to export high-tech goods to the rest of the world. So that depends on having an educated population. So we're going to put more money into education and R&D. And meanwhile, we're going down a much more atomistic path where we're forcing people to compete with each other. And when you do that, you strip the public sphere of the capacity to have these kind of... You strip politics anyway, perhaps not the public sphere, because we're having these conversations here.
Yeah.
Can I just respond to that just a little bit, because I just want to tease that out. I agree with Adam on the fundamental premise that education is critically important to our national well-being. I think on that we can happily agree. You know, we do need to have a good and strong investment in our education system to make sure that we can be globally competitive. When you actually think about the opportunities that are available to us, particularly within the Asian region, which is our most local neighbourhood, we've got around about 500 million people who are currently in the middle class. By 2030, it will be around about 3 billion people. That presents both opportunities and also competition. And education is going to be the skill set that we need to be able to compete in that global environment. But what I would say is that this idea that spending directly equates to better outcomes is not one that I agree with. You know, the idea that if you spend more, you care more, or therefore you get better outcomes, I think doesn't necessarily follow. I also think that it's important to note that just as there are visible winners out of, say, free education, the person who gets the benefit of that education, who also then gets the benefit of a much, much higher income over their lifetime. In fact, Andrew Leigh, a Labor Member of Parliament, the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, said it was more than $1 million over a lifetime that you get the benefit of a higher education. What we are asking people who don't get the benefit of that education to do is to actually fund those people who will ultimately receive a personal benefit. What the government has proposed is that currently the mix between the private component, how much the student contributes to their education, and how much is contributed by the state, is currently on average around about 60% the state and about 40% the individual. And they don't start paying $1 back until they earn over $50,000, and it's based on a very low interest rate, the cost of funds effectively to government. What we are suggesting with the reforms is that we effectively invert that, so that the person who receives the most benefit will pay a little bit more and the state pays a little bit less, which means that the person in the street who actually doesn't get a higher education, who might in fact be working from the age of 18, don't themselves have to spend as much in funding that system, that there is a bit more personal responsibility for those who are actually receiving the benefit. But also too, I think you have to note that people under this reform process who have access to higher education is much, much broader. What hasn't been mentioned is that we are talking about 80,000 more students every year who will be funded, who have never before been funded through the higher education system. People who don't necessarily go to universities but who have sub-bachelor degrees, but for whom it is important to actually get that qualification in order to set themselves up for life and to contribute to our nation.
I guess what I'm saying though is if you take a step back, like, we should be able to ask and answer the question in Parliament, in the public, what is Australia going to look like in 20 years' time? What are we going to sell the rest of the world? What's our internal economy going to look like? And it's almost as if at the moment plan is a four-letter word. People don't want to sit back and look to the future and say, what kind of things do we need to put in place to ensure that we've got the kind of society we want? And so if you take, sort of zoom out a bit, on science and research and innovation, including the money that goes to higher ed, we are now spending the lowest in Australia that we have since we started keeping records in the late 70s. And when you add together the public and private spending on R&D, and this is an area that I think you and I probably agree is going to sustain Australia into the future. We're spending the lowest that we have for over 30 years. So we're at about 2.2% of our GDP, public and private added together, being spent on R&D. You look at our key trading partners, you look at people in the region like Japan and Korea, they're spending upwards of 4% on their, Israel spends close to 6%. The United States has set itself a target of spending 3% of its GDP on R&D. We're not even having that discussion. And so as a result, all that happens is we go from election to election saying who can offer the biggest tax cuts. And then after that comes the hangover the next day, which is, well, you can have the tax cuts, but then that means there's less money to spend. And so we start cutting spending on things like universities or health and medical research, and it becomes sort of a self-fulfilling circle. And then, my worry is that we'll wake up when the mining boom is over to find we're a hollowed-out, uneducated quarry, and we haven't had this discussion.
Certainly, I believe that you only get prosperity out of the real economy. Whilst you can buffer it a bit, I suppose, by various artificial means like saving or superannuation schemes. Effectively, the real economy delivers resources to people, and I guess we've all had experience of that when there was a mining boom, the real economy is performing well, governments can make all sorts of decisions that its citizens are happy with, and so I suppose I'd be more thinking about what kind of investment we should make now that constructs a real economy in the future that is likely to perform. I think Adam's quoted a few examples. There are others around the world where people are perhaps trying to anticipate that future. And I'm not so sure that our discourse is focused on that. But Kelly, what sort of real economy do you think we could construct, say, in the 5-10 year horizon, which is in the horizon of 2 or 3 political cycles, that perhaps for whatever reason we don't have the aspiration to invest in? What can we do better?
Well, I'd perhaps frame it slightly differently, because I do agree with Adam that research and development is one of the keys to our future as a nation. On that, in fact, Adam and I have signed up to, I think very unusually, we both actually during the last Parliament had a joint motion that went through the Parliament about the importance of science and technology, innovation and development. Now the question is, how do you best achieve that? How do you best achieve that as a nation? And there are some that propose that the state needs to pick winners, needs to make particular investments in particular industries, and that the command and control economy is the way to go. Well, I think we have seen a lot of evidence internationally to demonstrate that that is not the best way to be able to deliver outcomes, and that the better way is to get the broad policy settings right to unlock potential of businesses and individuals to be able to create opportunities in this country, whether it's through the tax policies that we put in place. So, for instance, I think having tax breaks for research and development, I think, is very, very important. I think making sure that we can encourage people to make those private investments will actually unlock the sort of potential and the innovation that we want to see. So I think having the policy settings right, having a deregulated economy so there's not so much red tape when people actually want to set up a business, they want to invest their own capital, they want to employ people. That is going to be the key to our future, and that's going to be the key to being flexible as well, to being able to respond to the changing global environment. And I think education, I think research and development, I think all of that comes together to look at what Australia should ultimately look to compete in, and I think that's where we can be ultimately very, very competitive. We are an entrepreneurial nation, and the key is to make sure that we don't get in the way of that entrepreneurial spirit.
Well, I guess I was at a meeting last year where Australia's startups and innovation was being compared to Israel, and on those figures we wouldn't look very entrepreneurial or have much of a risk appetite at all. And
well, I'll tell you, you're right. I think
on international standards, I'm not sure that we can demonstrate.
Well, I think but I think we have made it harder and harder for businesses to be able to set up. We have a very different attitude to success and failure in this country, despite the entrepreneurial spirit I've talked about. In the United States, people can set up and fail and set up again and start anew, and that is seen as part of the broader experience about getting better. In Australia, we perhaps, I think, have a different attitude, which is if you failed once, you are a failure. And I think that sometimes is a little bit inhibiting. But I'll give you an example. I think employee share schemes is one of those ways that we can encourage people to invest capital. Those who risk their own capital should in fact get a pretty serious reward, because a lot of people who risk capital, particularly in setting up small businesses, actually do lose that capital. Those that are successful, those who work incredibly hard, do deserve to actually have the benefit of the time, the innovation that they've put into that business, and the risk of in many respects, people put their houses on the line in order to create those opportunities. Employee share schemes, which was mucked around with by the previous government, actually killed a lot of that innovative spirit. We've started the task of repairing that so as to make it a lot easier for people to be able to attract the best global talent to their business by rewarding them in the future should the business be successful. And that's what they do in the United States. That's been demonstrated to be successful there. That's something I think that we should look as a good example to here in Australia.
Can I come back to Adam, just to ask the same question, Adam? The real economy, 5 years, 10 years out, what are the sort of decisions we could be making now that might be demanding sacrificial, costly decisions that would better situate us for even that visible future 5-10 years out?
Well, I think that the former member for my seat, Lindsay Tanner, said what I think is a really good question, which is, what is Australia going to sell the rest of the world in 15 years' time? And I think you would have to say, on current policy settings, it's probably coal, gas, maybe a bit of uranium thrown into that as well. And there is no, it would come as a bit of a shock to Lou Bandt, who invented the ute back in 1930s, to know that since 2009, Australia has made more every year exporting health and medical products than we have exporting cars. And the only manufacturing company in the ASX top 20 is CSL, which makes biological and health-related products. So in a sense, the economy has shifted, but we've also got to recognise that we do, nonetheless, in this country, have a de facto industry policy where we do already identify companies and sectors that we think are worthy of support, and we give them huge support. And I'd call it picking winners, except I think it's backing losers. And we give about $3 or $4 billion a year to fossil fuel companies to continue to do what they're already doing without any help from the government, and that's $4 billion that can't go into health and medical research. That's $4 billion that can't go into universities or into schools. And so at the moment, you go and put petrol in your car and you pay 38 cents a litre in tax. When Gina Rinehart's wealthy mining company goes and does it, they get a rebate for that 38 cents a litre paid for by you, and that costs about a couple of $1 billion. So if you ask most people, would you rather us put money into health and medical research or help Gina Rinehart buy cheap petrol? I know what they would say. So we've got a de facto industry policy in this country that supports the big banks to make world-leading record profits because they know that they can rely on the government if they ever get into trouble, and that supports the big miners because they're the ones who have the ear of Parliament. And that takes several $1 billion a year out of the system that we can't then put into those other areas of growing a real economy. And I think, in a nutshell, we need to move beyond dig it up, chop it down and ship it off, and towards an economy that's based on innovation and based on our brains. But the government has to create the right ecosystem for that. And part of that is actually not, and this is where I disagree with Kelly, you can't just wash your hands from that. You have to create the right ecosystem, and that means investing in some things that might not turn a buck straight away. It is hard to work out how you make money out of telescopes, like buying those big telescopes, but we've got a Nobel Prize winner as a result of investment in astronomy in Australia, and there are all the spin-offs that come from people working in those particular areas that you can't even foresee, like Wi-Fi, right? But it's a sign of our society, do we want to invest in that basic research? And instead, what we're doing at the moment, the government is saying, unless you pass our higher education reform bill, we're going to take away money from national research facilities like telescopes. Now, that is crazy short-term thinking. That's the long-term getting caught up in short-term political tactics. And what it means is, yes, you can have the debate about whether we have a failure culture or not, but if you're a young scientist or researcher in Australia, you will look here where we think about funding cycles in the short term, or you will look to the US where they say, we'll make some money available, or you look to the UK where they say, we'll make some money available for you to have a 5-year contract, and you go. And you look at every budget debate where we keep treating these public goods as a honeypot to dip into every time the budget gets tight. And the brain drain continues. So I think it's more than just, you can't just throw caution to the wind and throw people to the wolves and say, you're on your own, stand or fall on your own 2 feet. Government we've got to stop backing losers and start putting the money into creating the right ecosystems for the future.
Well, I wonder in what you said, though, whether you're describing a political circumstance where some things are too big to fail, and the political impact of something failing and unemployment being lost out of particular sectors is politically terrifying, or whether it is an intentional economic policy. I mean, I think the banks, the big miners, I could see there's that too big to fail element. I think we've got a strong element in our culture in Australia of socialising losses and privatising profits. That's well established across a range of industries for these understandable political imperatives. But So I'm not sure there are intentional economic policies that you're describing, but they tend to be de facto ones. And it's perhaps, to me, the fact that they go in a way unexamined or not really teased out that perhaps is the issue. But I'd be interested in you both talking about this, the extent, because people here, we're not involved in knowing it, but the extent of lobbying. What kind of pressure do you get from interest groups wanting to protect or to further their financial interests that are effectively, political instruments seeking to get some change? Is that something you experience as elected members?
There are lots of rent seekers, absolutely, because there are lots of people who are very keen to preserve their own interest to be paid for by somebody else. And I think probably the one point I would, in terms of what Adam's just discussed before, the one point I would make is that there isn't a miraculous money tree that exists. The money tree that exists, if we are to talk about the finite resources that we have, is not the government and the government money. That money comes from taxes that people pay. And we must never, ever forget that. That comes from people who work incredibly hard and pay money to the government in the form of taxes that then is decided upon as to where we as a nation will get the most benefit from the utilisation of those taxes. And I think it's really important to note that around about 2/3 of all taxes paid, 70% of the revenue that is derived by government is paid by about a sixth of people who actually pay tax. And just to consider, people who are on an income of around $80,000 or above, which is only $6,000 more than the average income for a full earner over the course of a 12-month period, they're in that income bracket that is actually currently funding it. So I think when we talk about raising taxes, which in effect is the broad suggestion I think that comes from the Greens and from some of the other parties that advocate much, much bigger spending policies, we have to ask the question, well, where does it come from? We always, in our own lives, have to make priorities as to where our money is spent. We do that on a day-to-day basis as to how we spend our money. And government is no different. Government also has to make the right decisions about where it spends its money. And I think Adam's right to say that we should have a conversation about where that money is best spent. But it is not infinite. And I think we would be absolutely wrong to suggest that somehow you can just ever increase tax and think that this will have no unintended consequence whatsoever.
I think there's two things though. One is what's the overall, what's the size of the pie? So what do people in this country think would be a fair amount of revenue for the government to raise? What should the size of government be based on the services that we expect? And we've even lost the capacity to have that conversation, which is a real shame, because I think actually most people are up for that conversation if you put it in that way. Second is the equity of where does the burden lie. And so, for example, let's have a conversation about why is it that superannuation tax concessions, for example, are now about to... we introduced superannuation to try and take the burden off the pension, and yet tax concessions for superannuation, especially for the wealthy now, are getting to the point where it's going to cost us more than the whole pension scheme.
And we're actually not taking the burden off the pension. I mean, the interesting point is, and the intergenerational report shows this, Adam, is that currently today about 70% of people who are on a pension or a part pension, those people aged 65 and above, in 40 years' time, that number will only go down by 3% who'll be on a pension or a part pension.
Housing, for example,
the question is superannuation working as it should.
Tax system set up by the government that encourages people and supports people. The government is spending money to support people buying their second or third home, which has the effect of increasing property prices so that people can't buy their first home. Now, why I don't think the government's role should be to help people buy their second and third home at the expense of someone buying their first home. But we haven't even had we've lost the capacity to have a discussion about that. But I want to come back to just noting the time. I mean, the topic of today is about the decisions that we make and what we're talking about the future. We've spoken about the intergenerational report. I think we can't have this conversation properly unless we talk about climate change. Nick Stern, Lord Stern, did the review that made it clear that the cost, if we don't act on climate change, is going to be somewhere around 5 to 20% of GDP by the end of this century. That's the cost of people dealing with climate change, so mitigating it, plus the cost to our society and our economy. So, for example, Ross Garnaut has said here, on current trajectory, unless we get global warming under control, expect a 92% decline in the productivity of the Murray-Darling Basin by the end of the century. Those are the kind of figures that we're talking about. And last, we had the government... last government come out and say, scientists say this is the critical decade. This has to be the decade in the whole of human history that Australian pollution is at its highest ever, and that we effectively need to become a zero pollution society by the middle of the century. Now, for a country that's built its energy system on it being copper lines that go out to coal mines, not out of any malintent, but people just thought that was the way to do it, that is a massive, massive change. And meanwhile, you've got the intergenerational report the first mention when it gets to climate change and economy is to say climate change might have some positive aspects for the economy. Like, that's the first mention of climate change in the economy in the intergenerational report. Now, what really gets me is that we are marching headlong into significant cost for future generations, and I just wish that we could start talking about the planet and our future the way that we talk about debt and the budget. Like, let's do future generations the courtesy of talking about their air and their water that the whole economy depends on, in the same way that we talk about fiscal responsibility.
But let's talk about both.
We're not doing it.
Let's talk about both, because, I mean, just taking your figures, and I'm not going to challenge your figures, I'm just going to take them as you have put them out there, you know, what was it, 5 or 6% of GDP as the effect of climate change. Now, I don't know where those figures come from, but I'm happy to accept them on face value. And let's put that in the context of the broader deficit and debt discussion as well, because I think you need to put context around it, because if you don't tackle some of the economic challenges, it makes it much, much harder to tackle all of the other challenges that are going to face us as a nation. Looking at the intergenerational report, our deficits are going to be upwards of around about 12% of GDP. Now, that's just the deficit. And you're saying half of that, you know, would actually address the issue of climate change. So it has a very real opportunity cost when you continue to build up deficits that then add to debt. And as Niall Ferguson, the economic historian, actually said, he said public debt is current generations living at the expense of those too young to vote or those as yet unborn.
But I could take that sentence and say exactly that about climate change. That is exactly what we're doing at the moment, is spending, putting things on the credit card and on the never never by using resources at a rate that we cannot sustain. And we know now that they didn't know 100 years ago, we know now the atmosphere is finite. And we know we can't, just as we can't keep throwing rubbish into the Yarra, we know now that we can't keep putting pollution into the atmosphere. So we've got the knowledge.
It's not a binary discussion. I think you need to address the issue of our environment. I think we can all agree we want to leave a better environment for future generations. The question is, how do we achieve that? And there is a path that
our view is to make polluters pay, and your view is to have government spending. It's a bit of a reversal.
No. Our view is, your view is about punishment and penalty, and our view is about incentives. So I mean, we can put it slightly differently, I suppose. And this is where the rubber hits the road. But I also think you can't ignore the broader economic debate. And this is where I find it really disappointing, and that is where there is an engagement on these broader issues around the environment, which I think is great. We do need to have a conversation about the sort of environment we want to live in and that we want to leave to future generations. But there is a real opposition to actually understanding and addressing the economic challenges we face today and the potential major challenges we are going to face into the future. And
let me ask you this. Tell me what you think the economic cost of climate change will be, and where I find that in the intergenerational report.
Yeah, so there is a chapter in the intergenerational report that actually
put a number on it. There's numbers on everything else. Put a number on it.
At climate change. Well, it's very difficult to put a number on it. I'm happy to go with your number. I'm happy to use the number that you've put, but I just want to put it into a context. And I also want to also make the point that if you continue on the sort of spending trajectory that we're currently on at the moment, and I think it is important to note that the current government is still, under current policy settings, increasing spending over the long term.
You know,
now, we've reduced it.
The carbon tax would have raised money.
3.7%.
By abolishing the carbon tax, you've created extra
let me
debt
finish.
for
Let
yourself.
me finish, and then you can go for it.
I might just change the topic slightly when you made your one point, Kelly.
Yeah. We were actually on a trajectory over the forward estimates of increasing spending as inherited by 3.7%, and we've now brought that down to 1%. And over the long term, over the next 40 years, assuming no new spending, assuming that we continue to have uninterrupted economic growth, which, by the way, would mean that we are beating countries like the Netherlands, who've had 26 years. We're in our 24th year, so it's a big assumption to assume we keep going like that. Then we will still have huge spending of around about 30% of GDP. That is massive. 30% of GDP.
Can I just bring in a thing that might, people who are here today might have some personal awareness of? I think it comes to the point Adam made about expectation, and I guess a lot of people I speak to are very grateful to even get a part pension because of some of the medical and pharmaceutical benefits they get. And it does go, I think, to the expectation Australians have of excellent medical services provided universally, and I think excellent educational services available universally. And most of these, except for the health side, many of these expenses are ones that reside in state governments, and the states can look like spenders, the Commonwealth can look like it looks like the one that's doing the hard work electorally and politically in clipping people's wages and taking taxes, whereas the states spend it. It seems to me that we've got not a very virtuous relationship between those things and but there's a reality that either we cannot meet in the future, that our expectations cannot be met, or this needs to be accepted as a reality that Australians will continue to have exceedingly high expectations about their access to that, and Australians don't actually want differential access to these services depending on your resource level, especially as people age and their independent ability to fend for themselves, struggle with others, becomes lessened. I'd be interested in your views on that, and then we're coming to a time when we'll open things up to discussion from people who are here today.
I think by and large those expectations are completely legitimate, and I think perhaps let's take a step back. What's the point in being a wealthy, smart country if some people in the country are unhealthy and don't have access to good quality health, especially as they get older? Right. This is presumably the economy is there to serve society, not the other way around. And presumably, the reason that we create a real economy and invest in it and keep it strong is so that we can have a good quality of life. I think where we need to recalibrate expectations is, perhaps we can't afford to offer such generous tax concessions, say, with respect to super or some of those other kind of things, if it comes at the expense of, or for Gina Reinhardt to buy a cheap petrol, if it comes at the expense of older people being able to get good quality healthcare. And that's the debate I think we need to have. And you don't have to look. I mean, there exists one of the world's happiest countries is apparently Denmark, and people report extremely high standards of living, and they also report, some of them, having to pay more than half their income in tax. And they know that if they do that, they know that should they ever get sick, they're going to be looked after. If they want to go to school or they want their kids to go to school, there's going to be a good quality education. Now, the Australian population is probably not quite there, not quite ready to go there, but it's the debate that we should have. Like, how much are we prepared to spend in terms of tax to get the quality of services that we expect? And
well, the top marginal tax rate's about 49 cents with the deficit levy and the Medicare levy on top of the actual top tax rate. So we're pretty much there.
Well, for some people we are, but then there are loopholes that allow you to have $1 million in your superannuation account and be drawing $100,000 out of that a year and paying next to no tax on it. And is that right? Is that right at a time when we're telling people you should cut the pension, that others should be getting tax breaks for if they're millionaires? Now,
so we're not cutting the pension.
The point.
You do have to be honest about that. The growth in spending on the pension will decrease, but it will still grow. The pension is still going to grow. New increases will still happen twice a year with the pension. I think it's misleading to suggest that somehow the pension is going to be cut, because that's not correct.
It's cutting the rate of growth.
Well, I think we've touched on some things that some people here this morning might have some experience and strong views on. So let's open it up to some interaction.
Warren Buffett, one of the world's richest capitalists, actually agrees that his class ought to pay more tax. Now, if a capitalist can say that because he can see that his class is accumulating so much money, and Stiglitz and Krugman, the economists, argue the same, and we can feel that wealth is falling in fewer hands, but Kelly, you represent the Liberals who back capital and accumulation of capital. Therefore, I can't see how you can help working class people earn or keep some of the money they earn and help distribute wealth around society. Because you can't even back Warren Buffett, the capitalist.
My name is Stig Jensen, and I would like to also volunteer to pay more tax because I could certainly afford it, and I've had the good fortune of accumulating some wealth through my working life. What does concern me deeply is it's not for me, but it's for my grandchildren and for your unborn child, is that we have a leader at the moment who claims that coal is good for humanity and that climate change is crap. Now, so far it's meant that approximately $15 billion worth of renewable energy projects have been on hold for the last couple of years, and we have also increased the number of unemployed by about 100,000 in that same period, whilst we would have the opportunity of generating many tens of thousands of jobs in the renewable energy sector as compared to mining, where less and less people are employed and all the profits, or certainly more than 80%, goes off offshore.
Thank you very much.
This follows on from the last question, but relates to Adam's grandfather. And I do wonder how he would feel to understand that the last ute to be produced in Australia will roll off the production line in about 3 or 4 years' time. But it relates to the way that Australian inventions do seem to go overseas, and it relates to the last question about renewable energy. Those of you who saw Catalyst on the ABC last night would have seen the amazing leaps forward that are being made in capturing of solar energy. Could I ask firstly, do we agree that solar energy is the way to go in the future, replacing fossil fuels? Secondly, how quickly could we replace fossil fuels with solar energy while not destroying the fossil fuel industry in an instant? But surely it must go as renewables take over. And thirdly, how can we keep the Australian inventions of solar energy capture in Australia for manufacturing in Australia?
Why don't I tackle the very first question first to the gentleman who asked it. I think when you're comparing the American system and the Australian system, you are not comparing like with like. We have one of the most progressive tax systems in the world. And when I say progressive tax system, what I mean is that the more you earn, the more tax you pay in this country, and we redistribute that wealth. We have a very strong tax and transfer system, and it means that we have a strong social safety net, which is something I think Adam and I probably absolutely fundamentally agree on. There are some people in our society who do require our help. There are people who do need the help of government in order to be able to live the best possible life that they can live. But that's not true of everybody in society, and you have to have the right balance in a society where you do reward people for their hard work and their effort. You do allow them to keep some of that income that they earn so that they can provide for themselves, for their families, provide the sort of investment opportunities that we want to see in this country, and take the risks that we also want them to take in order to employ people and to grow our economy. So that's the first point I'd make about tax. In relation to climate change, I actually spoke about climate change in my maiden speech only a number of years ago. I think climate change is real. Man is making a contribution to our changing climate, and I think we do need to act. The question is, what do we do? And we have a difference of view as to how we actually tackle this particular problem. We do have, with the Labor Party, I'm sure it's different with the Greens, I actually haven't looked at your policy on this and Adam will correct me, but we do have the same mandatory renewable energy target. Currently it's about 20%, but in practice it is 27% at the moment, and electricity consumption has gone down, which has meant that the new investment into technology, into large-scale production, has ceased as a result of going beyond that target. Solar energy, those small-scale targets, are absolutely supported by the government. There has been no change to that scheme. Will solar energy be in a position to replace fossil fuels? I don't know the answer to that, but I would suggest that there are some fundamental problems with solar energy being able to provide the sort of baseload power that we require as a nation. And I think if we really want to have a proper energy debate about low emissions technology, you can't not talk about nuclear power.
Part of the problem with what you just said, though, is that your government is out trying to cut the renewable energy target. Like, what you're saying is that because people are now using less energy, and because the proportion of renewable energy is growing thanks in part to the renewable energy target, it's been too successful, so we better wind it back. And there's two kinds of denial about climate change. One is denial of the science, the other is denial of the consequences of the science. If you accept the science, you have to accept the consequences of the science. And the consequences of the science say that for Australia to play our fair share, as I said before, we have to become a zero pollution society by the middle of the century at the latest. And that is a big technological challenge and it's a big social challenge. In Germany, they've got 400,000 jobs in the renewable energy sector. Adjusting for population, that's about 100,000 jobs in the Australian context. And they're jobs installing solar PVs, they're jobs working for the businesses that do that, they're jobs making wind turbines, they're jobs using the kind of know-how that the Germans previously and currently use to make cars to now make great gears for inside wind turbines. And I wish it was my grandfather, he was a far more distant relative than that, but there is, as I was saying, there is the Bandt Bridge. As you go down, take the bypass out of Geelong and you'll go over the Bandt Bridge. It makes me smile every time I go past there. But we now have a situation in Victoria and South Australia where the three big car makers are about to pull out. We found out that there's potentially $800 million now available in the money that was going to support the car makers and component makers that's now not going to be spent because they're pulling out early. Let's put that money into getting a share of the anticipated $500 billion electric car market. Let's, rather than let the whole thing collapse and then try and rebuild something in the future, let's say, well, we're going to need components and car parts for public transport and electric cars. Let's use a proportion of that money and let's keep some jobs in Victoria and South Australia. And instead, we're turning our back on a very jobs-rich future in renewables and a jobs-rich future in alternative fuels. And it requires a little bit of planning to do that, but we can do it. And the sun doesn't shine at night, but you can store energy overnight. Like, we're working out how to do it. And the future will be decentralised energy production. And we've got to get on board with that. And the electricity companies realise that, and they're screaming. But the answer is not to cut the renewable energy target. The answer is to say, well, it's great that it's working. Let's boost it. And that's not the direction that we're going at the moment.
And I'm interested in that question about how we use innovation and make it commercially successful that feeds into the wealth of Australia. Because I think that we certainly know, we all realise we live in an international knowledge economy. The The rise of the number of Chinese universities now in the top 100 in the world has been spectacular. The status of our universities and the associated research parks that are around them is certainly, I think, a model we should look at. I think we should really understand better how it is that Melbourne has become such a preeminent place for biomedical research and learn some of the lessons, because, it is true, you can't always engineer these things but you can create factors where people come together and you get the people who've got that capacity not to go offshore to other countries where the integration between academia and research application and commercial development is far greater. I think we need to find that integration, and it seems to me there are some relatively simple policies and probably fairly modest investments that actually could move us in that direction, because we have had some spectacular achievements in Australia, and if we could reproduce those in other sectors of innovation for the future economy, I think we would be very well placed to have a much greater confidence about the growth of the real economy, rather than, in a way, a sad wind down and needing to everyone manage expectations downwards.
Can I suggest two things? One is we need a national target for how much we're going to spend on research and development, both public and private. And the US has set itself the target of 3% of GDP. We're currently at 2.2%. So if we set ourselves the target of 3% of GDP, you're looking at the government over the next few years putting in $200 million extra each year, cumulatively, over several years, into research and development. And if there was that national target and it had the commitment from across the parliament, then I think that would go quite some way of doing it. And part of that is, as Kelly said, tax breaks. Just 2 weeks ago in the Senate, the government, to balance the budget, is cutting the R&D tax break and is trying to do it in two respects. And that, I think, is a lazy way of raising money and a short-sighted way of raising money. The second thing I think we need to get a handle on is job security for people who work in the area. Because so many of the people, if you're looking at a career in research at the moment, you're looking at 1, maybe 2-year contracts at a time. You're looking at massive funding uncertainty for your project, and it's affecting people's decisions about when they're going to start their lives, when they're going to have kids, whether they can get a house, because the bank manager says, well, if you're on a 1-year grant, I'm not interested in giving you a mortgage. And so people then look to the US or the UK where you can get a 3 or 5 year contract. And extending the grant cycle to 5 years, which this government has done in part, is good, but unless you increase the size of the pie, all that does is reduce the number of available grants, because there's fewer of them, but they're available for longer. So we need to grow the size of the pie and give people more security, and then I think you'll see more people wanting to stay here.
And I think, 5-year grants is actually very, very important to provide that security, and also too, I'm one of the founders of the Parliamentary Friends of Women in Science, Maths and Engineering, and another factor that particularly affects women in this area has been the interruption of childbearing in their research roles, and the ability to continue on with that research when that is interrupted, and the measurement of their applications against the time spent working when the NH and MRC looks at this issue. And we've had quite a lot of success in raising this as a broader issue. The NH and MRC now look at the amount of time women spend and prorata that when they look at the application before them, so that women are not at an inherent disadvantage when also making applications for funding. But I think the final point, just to add to what Adam has said, that I would say is that the government has actually put forward, I think, a very visionary idea around a medical research future fund, $20 billion fund that will actually add to the health and medical research that we are going to need in our nation, which we are very good at, which will benefit all of our society as a whole, and also internationally benefit the world with some of the discoveries that we come up with here, which are world leading and world's best practice. And being able to deliver on that, you can only deliver on investing money into the future when you actually manage the money that you have today. You know, it's like with anything. It's like with a household budget. You actually have to manage the money you have today in order to make those savings and those investments in the future, which is where the broader discussion about the economy comes into play.
The big four banks are making world-leading record profits. Let's make them pay for the future fund rather than charging people more to see the doctor.
I'd just like to pick up on Adam's point about a more combative discourse in our community at the moment. And I'd like, Kelly, to ask you why it is that Tony Abbott is so combative when there's conversations about building the infrastructure for our transport system in Melbourne so we can get the clever people to the medical research centre and zoom them down to the corporate centre. So why do we have to be combative about our conversation about whether we build a rail or road? And I think most people would say, yeah, we need both, but we've got our leader who says, I stick to my knitting and we do roads. So Kelly, there's my question.
Most interested in the conversation today, and it seems to be, to me, to be a battle between ethics and morality. What I do find interesting is a small ad in The Age the other day that said we were to bring the waste, nuclear waste from France to be processed and stored in Australia. In terms of the future, who's going to bear the cost of such process? It'll be at Lucas Heights until we develop the processing. Where's it going to be stored? And that is not just a small intergenerational issue, but it is an everlasting issue for Australia.
I'd just like to pick up on the four-letter word, plan, that Adam mentioned. Having travelled overseas in recent times and having travelled to Singapore, I actually had a meeting with Austrade, and the lady there mentioned to me that the planning of Singapore was undertaken, or their first plan was undertaken by an Australian, and he was about to have his 90th birthday. It seems to me that amongst Australians we do have planners and visionaries. Wouldn't it be a great thing if in significant areas of government expenditure we could have people that could provide fearless, independent advice and good planning?
I work in a hospital, and last week I looked in the hospital pantry and I found, I looked in the catering cans of all the big cans of food that they had. There were cucumbers from India, peaches from China, apricots from South Africa, tomato puree from Spain, pears from South Africa, beetroot from New Zealand, SPC, red kidney beans, imported, and Edgell 4 bean mix, Italian. And the only Australian product was SPC apples, proudly declared as Australian Granny Smiths. The rest of the products were very, very small print. You had to look right down at the bottom of the can to find where those products came from. My question is, are we going to be able to feed ourselves in the future? What's going to happen to our industry? And where are we going to go as economic and climate change refugees when we can no longer feed ourselves?
There is a fundamental distinction between the role of the state government and the role of the federal government. This has often been confused over the years, and I think governments of all persuasions have actually led to increased confusion about who's responsible for what. But traditionally, the federal government has been responsible for road infrastructure, and traditionally the state government has been responsible for rail infrastructure. Now, we can argue the toss about that, but happily for us, there is going to be a Federation white paper that looks at who should be responsible for these areas, and how are we going to build the sort of infrastructure that we need in this country to ensure that we have the benefit of both good roads and good rail. I think I'll jump straight to the next point on plans, because I think this ties in with the point that you've raised, and that is that we do have the benefit of third parties who actually do provide a longer term than one government perspective on infrastructure projects. And we've got Infrastructure Australia that actually provides a plan to both governments and to third parties as well about the sort of infrastructure we need in this country. The question is, do governments always listen to the independent advice that is provided? I think more often than not, they will listen, but not always. And we've seen an example of that in recent times down here in Victoria, where the East-West Link, which is a very important and vital road to be built here in Victoria, which would supply over 7,000 new jobs in the whole construction, would actually relieve the pressure and congestion on our roads, is not going to be built because it was an election promise not to build it, and therefore that's it. So I think sometimes politics does get in the way of good planning. On the issue of nuclear waste, I'm not familiar with the circumstances that you've outlined, but my broad philosophical perspective on this would be that where waste is created, waste should probably be disposed of, and if we are going to create a nuclear industry here in Australia, we do need to have a much broader discussion about that and a very open and frank discussion about that. And then finally, I would say to your point about whether we're going to be able to feed ourselves, absolutely, we are going to be able to feed ourselves in Australia. We, in fact, produce more than we possibly can consume in Australia, and we export, I think, something like 70% of our agricultural product overseas. The free trade agreements that have been entered into in more recent times with China, with Japan and Korea open up new markets and new opportunities and expand our economy for our agricultural producers, just as they do for our service providers. So I don't think we need to be too concerned about not being able to feed ourselves.
It's worth reading one of the, I think it was the Climate Council's report released last year that suggested that on current trends, unless we get global warming under control, Australia may by the end of the century in fact become a net importer of wheat. And I do have a real concern that we're not asking the right question about how do we ensure that that we're sustaining agriculture and that enough of it is going to be available to us, particularly when it comes to ownership of agricultural land. So I think that's a very real question, and I think it's sadly one we're not asking. When there's a spill at a wind farm, no one notices. But when there's an accident at a nuclear power plant, you have Fukushima. And we have not yet worked out a way of safely storing or disposing of radioactive waste. It's as simple as that. And it's what the history behind that ad that you saw in the paper is previous governments, Labor and Liberal, trying to foist on a community in Northern Territory outside a place called Muckaty Station, a nuclear waste dump that the local Aboriginal community didn't want. They took them to the federal court. As a result of that battle, the government backed off. And so now they're looking for another site around Australia for us to process domestic and international nuclear waste. And who's going to pay for it? Well, the taxpayer will pay for the cost of setting it up, and the people who live nearby, who are predominantly Aboriginal, if it's going to end up being stuck somewhere in the middle of Australia, are the ones who are going to pay for having a nuclear waste dump right next to them. I forget what the other questions were, but maybe we'll leave it.
Yep, there was the one about rail and road.
Oh, rail and road. I mean, God.
And our time is really gone, so just a couple of sentences.
Where's the Liberal government talks about a cost-benefit analysis for everything, and then when they get a cost-benefit analysis for East-West Link that says for every dollar you put into it, you're only going to get 70 or 80 cents back, they ignore it. And Tony Abbott came to town before the last election, before even seeing a cost-benefit analysis, and said, I'm going to take $1.5 billion out of the foreign aid budget to put into this road, when we all know that the best way to fix Melbourne's congestion is to get people out of the cars and into trams or trains so that there's more space on the roads. And he came here and said, I don't care, I'm going to do it. And then he said the Victorian election was a referendum on East-West Link, and when he lost that referendum, they've conveniently forgotten that. So I just wish there was more planning in planning, and that people who say that they believe in cost-benefit analyses actually are prepared to look at public transport as an efficient alternative, because you'll find it beats roads and cars hands down every time.
Thank you very much. Our time has gone.
Well, it's been nice to meet two people whose political careers may well see some of us who are here into our old age and past our employment. So we do hope you've learned something a little bit more about their motivations, their passions and their character, because we'll be relying on them, won't we? It's an interesting thing, isn't it, that I think that, you know, we once thought about the transcendent character of the state, and that in a way when we paid taxation, it became, it was no longer our money. It was sort of, you know, given into the more transcendent character of the state, and governments as elected then had discharge of those things. Clearly, from some of the things you've heard today, many of us feel that we've got a trailing ownership over the money as it goes into the corporate pot, and how we decide how those things are distributed is pretty important. So I think we've been helped by the conversation, and I hope that as you reflect on these things, you will have your own views about, in a way, the subtitle, the kind of sacrifices that we need to make now for a better future. And some people have said they're up to that. Some people have said they have different views. So glad for your participation this morning. So let me just close with a prayer as we sum up those things. Loving God, we thank you of your faithfulness from generation to generation, for the good gifts you give us. We thank you for this land, Australia, for its community and people. And we thank you for those who are elected to government leadership in the different levels of government in our country. We pray for their wisdom, for those who advise them, and we pray for us as citizens that we might take our responsibilities seriously into heart. And we ask that you would bless us in the uncertain future that we face as we look at many different international situations that change and make us feel uncertain, asking for your guidance for us and your peace and your blessing. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
So thank you very much. Once again, you please appreciate our guests.